In this episode, we step into a reality that surprises many brand new learners the first time they really notice it. Your organization can do everything right internally and still get hurt because someone you rely on gets it wrong. Modern businesses run on vendors, cloud services, consultants, contractors, payment processors, and software components that come from outside your walls, and each of those relationships can introduce security risk. This is called third-party risk, and it matters because attackers often choose the easiest path, which may be a smaller supplier, a misconfigured service provider, or a subcontractor that was never fully evaluated. The challenge is not to become paranoid and refuse every vendor, because that would stop the business from operating. The challenge is to remove blind spots by understanding what you are depending on, what could go wrong, and what controls and agreements reduce the chance of surprises. By the end, you should be able to recognize how supply chain risk shows up in exam scenarios, and you should have a clear, calm mental model for managing vendors and their subcontractors without turning your program into endless paperwork. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A practical way to begin thinking about third-party risk is to treat every external relationship as a security extension cord, because you are effectively plugging your business into someone else's systems, people, and decisions. Sometimes that plug is small, like a vendor that sends invoices and has no access to your environment. Sometimes it is huge, like a provider that hosts your critical data or runs a key business function on your behalf. The risk is not only whether the vendor gets hacked, but also whether the vendor mishandles your data, misconfigures a service, fails to patch, or makes a change that breaks availability. This is why third-party risk is not a single risk type. It blends confidentiality, integrity, and availability concerns into one relationship. Beginners sometimes assume that purchasing a service includes security by default, but security is not a feature you automatically receive. It is a set of practices that must be verified and maintained. When you manage third-party risk well, you are not guessing about the cord you plugged in. You are inspecting it, labeling it, and deciding where it can safely connect. The next important concept is scope, because third-party risk becomes manageable when you clearly define what the vendor touches and what the vendor does not touch. A vendor relationship can involve data access, system access, physical access, or process dependency, and each type changes the risk profile. If a vendor stores your customer data, the confidentiality risk is obvious, but the integrity risk matters too because altered data can cause harm even if it is never leaked. If a vendor provides a service your business depends on, the availability risk can become the most urgent concern because downtime can stop operations. If a vendor has privileged access for support, the risk expands because that access can be abused or stolen. If a vendor only provides a product with no ongoing connection, the risk may be concentrated in software updates and component integrity rather than day-to-day access. Security X questions often hide the answer inside scope because the correct control depends on what the vendor is actually doing. When you can describe the relationship in a sentence that includes data, access, and dependency, you remove a lot of confusion before you ever evaluate controls. A common beginner misunderstanding is thinking that third-party risk is mainly about the vendor's reputation, as if well-known companies are automatically safe and small companies are automatically risky. Reputation can be a signal, but it is not a control, and large providers can have large incidents. The more reliable approach is risk-based tiering, which means you classify vendors by the potential impact if they fail. A vendor that handles sensitive data or supports a critical business process should receive deeper evaluation than a vendor that provides office supplies. This is not about being harsh. It is about allocating attention where it matters most. Tiering also helps you avoid a program that treats every vendor the same, because that leads to either burnout or superficial reviews. In exam scenarios, you may be presented with multiple vendor types, and the best answer will often involve prioritizing assessment effort based on the vendor's role and access. When you tier correctly, you can justify why some vendors need stronger requirements, ongoing monitoring, and stronger contractual protections, while others need only basic checks. Once you know scope and tier, the next teaching beat is due diligence, which is simply verifying that a vendor can meet your security expectations before you rely on them. Due diligence can involve reviewing security documentation, understanding how data is handled, checking whether the vendor has a mature vulnerability management process, and confirming incident response readiness. The point is not to demand perfection, but to detect major gaps before they become your problem. A helpful way to think about it is that you are looking for evidence of repeatable security habits rather than one-time promises. If a vendor cannot explain how it controls access, how it patches systems, how it monitors for incidents, and how it trains staff, that is a warning sign that security is improvised. If a vendor provides clear answers, evidence, and a willingness to discuss controls, that suggests maturity. SecurityX may describe a situation where a vendor is being onboarded quickly, and the correct response is often to perform risk-based due diligence rather than skipping evaluation entirely. Due diligence is how you reduce the chance of buying risk that was visible up front. Contracts and agreements are where third-party risk moves from friendly conversation into enforceable expectations. And this matters because security is not stable if it relies only on goodwill. A contract can require specific security controls, define data handling rules, set notification timelines for incidents, and specify responsibilities for remediation. Many beginners think contracts are legal only, but in security, they act as governance because they define what must happen when things go wrong. For example, if a vendor suffers a breach, you need clarity on how quickly you will be informed, what details you will receive, and what cooperation is expected. If a vendor uses your data, you need clarity on what data can be collected, how long it can be retained, and how it will be destroyed at the end of the relationship. If availability matters, you need clear uptime expectations and response commitments, often expressed in a service level agreement, SLA. Once SLA is established, you treat it as a measurable promise rather than a marketing phrase. Exam questions often test this by presenting a vendor incident where the customer is left in the dark, and the best answer involves contract language for notification, evidence, and accountability. Subprocessors are the part of this topic that creates blind spots if you do not take them seriously, because a vendor may rely on other vendors to deliver the service you think you bought. A subprocessor might host data, provide support services, run analytics, or handle specialized processing behind the scenes. The security risk is that your data and operations can flow into these fourth parties even if you never signed a contract with them directly. Beginners sometimes assume the vendor is one entity with one security boundary, but modern services are layered ecosystems. Managing this means you need visibility into whether subprocessors are used, what they do, and how they are governed. You also need a way to ensure the main vendor remains accountable for its subcontractors, because you do not want to chase a chain of blame during an incident. SecurityX scenarios may include language like vendor partners or third-party service providers used by the vendor, and the best answer often involves requiring disclosure of subprocessors and requiring the vendor to apply equivalent security controls to them. Without that visibility, you can end up with a secure front door and an unlocked side door you did not know existed. Another concept that helps you manage third-party risk without getting lost is data governance across vendor relationships, meaning you define what data is shared, why it is shared, and how it is protected end-to-end. Data minimization is a powerful principle here, because the safest data is the data you never share. If a vendor does not need sensitive fields to perform a service, you should not provide them. If a vendor needs some sensitive information, you can often reduce exposure by limiting scope, limiting retention, and limiting who can access it. Encryption is also part of governance, but the key is not the word itself. The key is ensuring data is protected during storage and during transfer, and that access to decryption capability is controlled. Beginners sometimes focus only on whether the vendor says data is encrypted, but a stronger approach asks how keys are managed, who can access data, and how access is logged. SecurityX questions often reward thinking that reduces exposure rather than trusting broad assurances. When you define the data relationship carefully, you turn a vague risk into a set of concrete decisions you can evaluate and monitor. Ongoing monitoring is the difference between a one-time vendor review and a living third-party risk program, because vendor risk changes over time even if your contract does not. Vendors update systems, change subprocessors, hire new staff, move services, and sometimes acquire or merge with other companies. Controls that were strong a year ago may weaken, and new services can introduce new data flows. Ongoing monitoring can include periodic reassessments, review of incident history, confirmation that required controls are still in place, and verification that key promises like SLA performance are being met. The important point for beginners is that monitoring is not about spying. It is about verifying that the relationship still matches your risk assumptions. On the exam, a scenario might describe a vendor that was approved long ago and then later became the source of a breach, and the correct answer often involves adding periodic review and monitoring rather than assuming the initial assessment is permanent. Monitoring also supports faster response, because you notice warning signs earlier instead of being surprised by a major failure. Concentration risk is another subtle area that matters more than beginners expect, because sometimes the biggest third-party risk is not that a vendor is insecure, but that too many critical functions depend on the same vendor or the same ecosystem. If multiple business systems rely on one provider, an outage or breach at that provider can create a broad business interruption. This is especially relevant when a single provider handles identity, hosting, and data storage across the organization, because those dependencies create a large blast radius. Concentration can also appear in software supply chains, where many products rely on the same underlying components or update mechanisms. SecurityX may test this by describing a widespread outage or compromise that affects multiple internal services at once, and the best answer can involve diversifying critical dependencies, strengthening resilience plans, and ensuring you have contingency options. Diversification is not always realistic, but awareness is still valuable because it influences recovery planning and contract decisions. If you can identify concentration risk, you can prioritize protections and recovery strategies that reduce systemic impact. A third-party risk program also needs clear internal ownership, because vendor security cannot be managed well if it is everyone's job, and therefore nobody's job. Procurement may own the purchasing process, legal may own contract wording, security may own control evaluation, and the business owner may own the relationship and day-to-day oversight. If these responsibilities are unclear, important steps get skipped, like renewing assessments, tracking changes in vendor scope, or enforcing contract requirements. Beginners sometimes assume security teams can manage vendors alone, but vendor risk management is cross-functional by nature. SecurityX is likely to reward answers that include governance elements like assigning accountable owners, maintaining a central vendor inventory, and requiring that vendor onboarding follows a defined process. Inventory is more important than it sounds, because you cannot manage what you cannot see, and many organizations do not realize how many vendors and subprocessors touch sensitive data. When ownership and inventory are clear, blind spots shrink, because the organization knows which relationships matter and who must act when something changes. Incident handling with vendors is another area where blind spots become painful, because the moment of a vendor breach is not the moment you want to discover that nobody knows how to coordinate. A mature approach defines how incidents are reported, how communications flow, what information must be shared, and how joint investigations are handled. It also defines what happens if the vendor's response is slow or incomplete, because you may need to take protective actions on your side, such as disabling integrations, rotating credentials, or informing affected stakeholders. Beginners often imagine incident response as an internal process, but third-party incidents require coordination across organizational boundaries, which introduces delays and misunderstandings if expectations are not set. The exam may present a scenario where a vendor suffers a breach and the organization must decide what to do. And the best answer often includes rapid containment actions on the customer side, combined with contract-driven notification requirements and evidence collection. This is also where the ability to prove what happened matters, because leadership and regulators may ask for timelines and facts. When you plan vendor incident handling upfront, you reduce chaos during the most stressful moments. An exit strategy is the final teaching beat that makes third-party risk management feel complete, because every vendor relationship should include a plan for how it ends, even if you hope it never ends. Exit planning includes how you retrieve your data, how data is destroyed on the vendor side, how access is removed, and how business operations continue if the vendor fails. It also includes thinking about portability, meaning whether your business can realistically move to another provider if needed. Beginners often assume vendor relationships are stable, but vendors can go out of business, change terms, suffer major incidents, or become unacceptable for compliance reasons. If you do not plan for exit, you may remain trapped in a risky relationship because the cost of leaving is too high. Security X questions might hint at this by describing a vendor that suddenly becomes unreliable or non-compliant, and the best answer can involve activating contingency plans and ensuring contractual rights for data return and deletion. Exit strategy is not pessimism, it is resilience, and resilience is a core security outcome. As we wrap up, the most important thing to remember is that third-party risk is not a special side topic. It is a normal part of modern security because most organizations operate through external dependencies. Managing it well starts with understanding scope and tiering vendors based on potential impact, then performing due diligence that looks for repeatable security habits rather than vague assurances. Strong contracts and SLA expectations turn those habits into enforceable commitments, while visibility into subprocessors prevents hidden fourth-party risk from creeping in unnoticed. Data governance decisions like minimization, controlled access, and retention limits reduce exposure before controls even come into play, and ongoing monitoring keeps the relationship aligned as vendors and services change. Concentration risk reminds you that dependency itself can be a threat multiplier, and clear internal ownership ensures the program runs consistently instead of being reinvented for each purchase. Finally, planning for vendor incidents and vendor exits closes the blind spots that hurt the most under pressure because you are ready to act rather than scramble. If you can apply this mindset to exam scenarios, you will consistently choose answers that reduce surprises and create traceable, enforceable security outcomes.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.